This is Dr. Chris Masterjohn of chrismasterjohnphd.com, and you're listening to Mastering Nutrition. This is episode 41, where we talk about the new position paper by the American Heart Association and answer the question, is coconut oil killing us?
This is Mastering Nutrition with Chris Masterjohn. Take control of your health, master the science, and apply it like a pro. Are you ready?
Coconut oil. We are about to dig deep into it. But first, a word from my sponsor. This episode is brought to you by US Wellness Meats. I discovered this company at PaleoFX this spring, and I fell in love with them as soon as I tried their liverwurst. For years, I've known that I feel best when I eat a diversity of organ meats like liver and heart. I have a clearer mind, I feel more energetic, and my energy is much more stable between meals. But it's so hard and so time-consuming to make a sustainable habit out of preparing and cooking organ meats. US Wellness Liverwurst is 15% heart, 15% kidney, and 20% liver, with the remainder grass-fed beef. That's a whopping half organ meat. It takes zero time to prepare, tastes great, and finally makes consuming a diversity of organ meats a habit that I can easily sustain. But just because I'm obsessed with their liverwurst doesn't mean it'll turn out to be your favorite. US Wellness makes an even milder Braunschweiger that's 35% liver and 65% beef. And if you have a really sensitive palate and just want to get your feet wet with organ meats, their head cheese delivers the mildest taste with 15% heart, 15% tongue, and the remainder beef. They also sell an incredible array of other meat products in practically any cut you could want, all from animals raised on pasture. Now, this isn't just about high-quality grass-fed meat products that can up your nutritional game and save you time in the morning. It's also about saving money, and that's because I worked out a special deal for you. As a member of my audience, you can go to grasslandbeef.com, order whatever you want as long as your total order is at least 7 pounds and at least $75 after applying the discount, and as long as it's under 40 pounds. And you just enter the promo code Chris at checkout. Putting my name in the box earns you 15% off your order, and since you can order up to 39.9999999 pounds of meat at that discount, you can potentially save a lot of money. If you're on the fence or you're not ready for a big order, don't worry about it. You can use the promo code Chris not once, but twice. So order the minimum your first time, and if you love this stuff as much as I do, you can order the max the second time around and get the same level of discount. Or just max out your order both times and get just shy of 80 pounds of meat at the discounted price. Either way, head over to grasslandbeef.com and make sure you enter Chris at checkout to get the discount. Coconut oil has been in the news this week, and it hasn't been good news. Here are some of the headlines. Doctors: coconut oil has more bad fat than beef and butter. Coconut oil not as healthy as we think? Treat coconut oil like butter or beef fat, American Heart Association says. Stop eating coconut oil. It's only good as a moisturizer, study says. The truth about the so-called superfood coconut oil. Worse than lard. Researchers warn against trendy use of coconut oil in cooking. Guys, there's no need to go cuckoo for coconut oil. Why people are saying coconut oil is actually terrible for you. Health experts warn against coconut oil. And on and on and on. Actually, This all traces to the American Heart Association's new presidential advisory called Dietary Fats and Cardiovascular Disease, a presidential advisory from the American Heart Association. This is not centrally about coconut oil. It just has one section on coconut oil that makes up a very small portion of the paper, in which, yes, they say coconut oil is just like other saturated fats. It's going to raise your cholesterol levels and it's going to contribute to heart disease. And I think that the news picked up on this particular section precisely because coconut oil is trendy. And that's actually something that the AHA Presidential Advisory laments in that section. The section on coconut oil begins, "A recent survey reported that 72% of the American public rated coconut oil as a, open quote, healthy food, close quote, compared with 37% of nutritionists. This disconnect between lay and expert opinion can be attributed to the marketing of coconut oil in the popular press." It's kind of a funny way to start off, because if nutritionists are the experts here, and over a third of nutritionists consider coconut oil a healthy food, it seems like that's as much or more of a crisis from this perspective as 72% of the lay public thinking the same thing. And given the fact that scientific facts are not determined by consensus, they're determined by evidence, if over a third of what we're considering experts here are compelled by something that is presumably evidence to believe that coconut oil may be a healthy food, then it would appear that there is no consensus among these experts about what the facts actually are. But nevertheless, I think this American Heart Association presidential advisory should be looked at for what it actually is, which is a position paper about saturated fat in 2017. And I don't think that the motivation behind this advisory is really about coconut oil. It's really about what I said in episode 2 of this podcast, which is that as the cholesterol consensus crumbles, the stance against saturated fat softens. And the point that I made in episode 2 is that we have, on the one hand, the scientific report of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Committee dropping their recommendation to limit dietary cholesterol. And even though the end result is that the dietary guidelines in 2015 stated that you should eat as little cholesterol as possible, the fact that dropping the number made it up to that level shows that the consensus has totally crumbled. Even in the highest levels of dietary guidelines in the United States, yes, the guidelines are a product of conflicting beliefs about cholesterol that have led to dropping a specific recommendation about the upper limit and these statements to still avoid it. But that means the consensus has truly, truly crumbled. Meanwhile, I said the stance against saturated fat was just softening, because this softening of the saturated fat stance is happening at the edges of what is still a consensus of mainstream experts. And the critical event that was happening at the time of episode 2 of this podcast was that Christopher Ramsden, a medical investigator with the NIH and an adjunct professor with the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, published an analysis of unpublished data from the Minnesota Coronary Survey, and I think more importantly, published a meta-analysis of the randomized controlled trials of replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat and the effect of that intervention on heart disease risk. And this was really significant because that brought us to a point where very prestigious people were designing meta-analyses. A meta-analysis is an approach to pool together the data of many different studies to summarize it in a single result. And so at this point, we have meta-analyses from very legitimate sources that come to opposite conclusions about the effect of that intervention on heart disease risk. In the Ramsden paper, they had found that there was no benefit of replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. And meanwhile, there are other meta-analyses. For example, one that was published in 2010 by Dariush Mozaffarian and his colleagues that found that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat led to a 15% decrease in the risk of heart disease. And it's not that between 2010 and 2016 the evidence is changing. All these randomized controlled trials had been done years and mostly decades earlier. So the difference between the Mozaffarian 2010 meta-analysis and the Ramsden 2016 meta-analysis was really about the trials that they chose to include or exclude. In the Ramsden paper, they looked at what happens if we exclude certain trials that are not truly randomized, such as the Finnish Mental Hospital Study, or trials that did many other things besides make that dietary intervention, like the Oslo Diet Heart Study. And what happens if we include certain trials that everyone else is ignoring, like the Rose 1965 study or the Sydney Diet Heart Study, both of which found that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats increased the risk of heart disease. And so it all comes down to this debate about which trials do you include or exclude. And now that the saturated fat, the stance against saturated fat is starting to soften around the edges, nowhere near the point of reaching dietary guidelines committees like the cholesterol consensus crumbling has, but still beginning to penetrate the scientific literature and the activities of very respectable scientists. It is in this situation that the American Heart Association is coming forth and laying down its opinion and saying, here are the trials that we should and shouldn't include in a proper meta-analysis. Here's the conclusions that we get when we look at it the right way. And here's why we are going to reinforce the position that we've maintained since 1961, that you should replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats if you want to lower the risk of heart disease. And it's from that position about the true effect of saturated fats that the association makes its conclusion about coconut oil, which is basically just an extrapolation from that data. And so for that reason, we really should start with this point about how they analyzed the randomized controlled trials, because that's really the new unique contribution that they're making, is to come in and say, here's how we are going to narrow down the trials that we want to look at in this particular context. So what they did was, instead of making a meta-analysis of all the trials, they said that they want to look at the 4 core trials. And so they laid down some relatively strict criteria. They said that we want this core evidence to be trials that have compared high saturated fats with high polyunsaturated fats, that did not include trans unsaturated fat, such as what you would find from hydrogenated vegetable oils, as a major component, that it controlled the dietary intake of the intervention and control group, had at least 2 years of sustained intake of the assigned diets, proved adherence by objective biomarkers such as serum cholesterol or blood or tissue levels of polyunsaturated fatty acids, and collected validated information on cardiovascular or coronary disease events. And these were reasonable criteria. They said the reason for the 2-year minimum duration is that polyunsaturated fatty acids very slowly equilibrate with tissue fatty acid levels. It takes 2 years to achieve 60 to 70% of the full effect. I completely agree with that. I think these are good criteria. But I think when you look closely, what you'll see is that the way they applied the criteria leads to a very convenient collection of the evidence that supports this position, rather than a collection of the evidence that gives us a truly objective look at what the facts are likely to be. So if you look at the trials that they included, there are 4 of them. There is the LA Veterans Administration Hospital Study, the Oslo Diet Heart Study, the Medical Research Council Study, and the Finnish Mental Hospital Study. The Finnish Mental Hospital Study makes the largest contribution to their estimation that you would decrease the risk of heart disease by about 30% by replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. The Finnish Mental Hospital Study makes the largest contribution for 2 reasons. First of all, its size. Because there were more people and more cases of heart disease in that study, its results contributed to almost 32% of the total weight of the combined results. Also, it had the largest effect. It had a more than 40% reduction in the risk of heart disease. Compare that to 20% reduction in the case of LA Veterans Administration Hospital Study, 29% in Oslo Diet Heart Study, or 18% in Medical Research Council. So let's look at the Finnish Mental Hospital Study. Well, the header of this section is CVD outcomes, randomized clinical trials that lowered dietary saturated fat. The Finnish Mental Hospital Study is not a randomized controlled trial. What they did was they took 2 hospitals, and they had one hospital eat a high saturated fat diet for a period of years and then switched to a high polyunsaturated fat diet. And in the other hospital, they did the same thing, but in the reversed order. The polyunsaturated first, followed by the saturated fat. Now, there's only 2 hospitals. So can you randomize a number of 2? Kind of. I mean, you can flip a coin once and what you get is random. But if you randomize 2 hospitals to one of 2 orders, then what is randomized is the hospital. And you can't do a statistical analysis on the groups of hospitals because you have one hospital that's in one group of hospitals that followed one order, and you have the other hospital in the other group of hospitals that follows the other order. So you have two groups of hospitals, and each group contains one hospital. Well, if your N is 1 in each group, how do you do a statistical analysis? How do you get statistics? The only way you can get statistics is to look at the incidence of heart disease in the individual people within the hospital. But if you're analyzing the incidence of heart disease in the individual people, then what you're analyzing is the people who were not randomized within the hospitals. In other words, if your statistical analysis is on the occurrence of heart disease in the individual people, then you're analyzing something that was not randomized. Therefore, your analysis cannot be said to be an analysis of a randomized controlled trial. And as much as that may sound like it's tedious or semantic, it's actually really, really practical. Because one of the things that Christopher Ramsden has shown is that the people within the hospitals were being treated at a very high incidence with an antipsychotic medication that was later shown to cause heart disease. And if you look at where the heart disease was elevated, it was mostly elevated in the hospital during the period of time in which that medication was used most. In other words, there's no way to know whether the incidence of heart disease was a result of the fact that in that hospital where they were using that medication a lot, they were eating a lot of saturated fat, or it was a result of that medication. Had you taken that hospital at that time point and randomized the individual people within the hospital to one diet or another, then you would have a randomized controlled trial, and you would presumably equally distribute the people who are taking that medication between the two groups and the people who weren't taking that medication between the two groups. And yes, it may have been contributing to heart disease, but it wouldn't have been biasing your analysis of the effect of the diet, because randomization would randomly distribute the use of that medication. So the Finnish Mental Hospital study is not a randomized controlled trial and has no place in a meta-analysis of a randomized controlled trial. It's just completely indefensible to include the Finnish Mental Hospital study in that. It is an observational study that was intended to be a randomized controlled trial and turned out not to be because of poor design. So here we already have the trial with the biggest effect carrying the most weight because of its size invalidated. So let's move on. The Oslo Diet Heart Study was a very complex intervention. Now, before looking at why Oslo is so complicated, let's look at the degree of strictness that the AHA itself wanted to apply to having properly controlled trials. They say, in addition to the 4 core trials, several other trials aimed to test the hypothesis that replacing saturated with polyunsaturated fats reduces coronary heart disease. We did not include these trials in our core group because they had a mixed dietary intervention in which polyunsaturated and carbohydrate replaced saturated fat and had insufficient duration, low adherence, few events, and or serious flaws in the study design. And then they go on to list and discuss the studies that they didn't include. But look at this look at how important they're considering the specific intervention of replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. They are dismissing trials on the basis that they had a mixed dietary intervention in which polyunsaturated and carbohydrate replaced saturated fat. So to simply add carbohydrate to the item that's replacing the saturated fat sets off their red flag that the study is too confounded. With that in mind, let's look at the confounders in the Oslo Diet Heart Study. The intervention in Oslo was to replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat and to restrict the intake of margarine containing hydrogenated vegetable oils, to increase the intake of fruits and vegetables, to increase the intake of fish, and they distributed free sardines canned in cod liver oil. Presumably those sardines have bones supplying calcium and glycine, an amino acid that's much more abundant in bones than in other animal products. Presumably the cod liver oil is providing vitamins A and D. A lot of things that could protect against heart disease just from the nutritional quality. And in addition to those intentional differences between the groups, you also had the control group starting out with the same number of heavy smokers at the beginning, but having twice as many heavy smokers by the end, and being older from the beginning and more overweight. But just ignoring those differences, you still have in the intervention, including restrictions in hydrogenated oils, increases in fruits and vegetables, and the provision of very nutrient-dense foods that go beyond simply replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. So if a trial adding carbohydrate to the intervention is sufficient for the AHA to exclude it on the basis that it's multifactorial, why isn't the inclusion of all these extra things found in Oslo not sufficient basis to exclude it for being multifactorial? So after excluding Finnish Mental Hospital Study for not being randomized, Oslo for being multifactorial, we're left with the LA Veterans Administration Hospital Study and the Medical Research Council Study. I think the LA Veterans Administration Hospital Study is one of the most important clinical trials ever done, and I think it's great to include it here. The reason it's so important is because, first of all, it's the longest trial ever conducted, being 8 years, where most of these are 5 or shorter, and you can see that in AHA, they were saying their minimum criteria is it's got to be at least 2 years long because it takes so long for these oils to have an effect. So the fact that it was really long makes it really, really important. Second of all, it's one of only 2 that were double blind. The design was to have inpatients in the hospital be randomized to one of 2 dining halls, and they would serve the exact same foods for 8 years in both dining halls. But in one dining hall, they'd use saturated fats, and in the other, they'd use polyunsaturated fats. And the people would have color-coded meal tickets that would allow them entry into only one of the dining halls, depending on their treatment group. And in fact, it's the only double-blind study that was included in the AHA meta-analysis. It's also important because the subjects were older, and that allows us to look at the risk of cancer, because cancer happens in general, the incidence of cancer is a lot higher for people who are older. And if you look at an aging population, they're going to go through a period where heart disease is dominant, and as the population ages further, heart disease starts to fade away and be replaced by cancer as the primary risk. So it really belongs in this discussion because of its importance. The problem with how it's dealt with in the AHA paper is the lack of nuance around the discussion of this trial. So what did it find because of its length? What did it find because of the age of the subjects? Well, in this trial, first of all, what you see on the surface level is that total mortality wasn't changed, but heart disease was reduced by the treatment. When you're looking at the fact that total mortality wasn't changed, what you have to look at is what happened to mortality from things other than heart disease. Well, it went up. And it especially went up because cancer went up. And this trial is so unique in having people who are old enough and having the treatment go on long enough to see that rise in cancer. And what's particularly disturbing is that the rise in cancer barely starts after 2 years, mostly starts after 5 years, and really gets going after 7 years. And so the length of this trial is so important because it suggests that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats causes cancer, but it takes you 5 to 7 years to be able to see it. And that point is nowhere mentioned in the American Heart Association paper at all. Now, on the surface, this lack of difference in total mortality looks like disease substitution. It looks like replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats lowers your risk of heart disease and raises your risk of cancer. But if you look even deeper, you find some nuances that really, really deserve attention. So, first of all, although the purpose of randomizing is to equally distribute the confounding variables, known and unknown, between the treatment groups, that's only successful when the trial is large enough. And this trial, with fewer than 1,000 people, wasn't large enough for randomization to successfully equilibrate the number of smokers between the different groups. And so, as a result, the control group, the group getting the saturated fat, had twice as many heavy smokers and 60% more moderate smokers, whereas the experimental group, the polyunsaturated fat group, got more light smokers and more non-smokers. And this is really important because smoking contributes to heart disease. And one of the ways that smoking contributes to heart disease is by contributing to oxidative stress. One of the ways that smoking contributes to oxidative stress is to oxidize vitamin E and cause it to be depleted from the body. We don't know exactly the mix of oils that was in the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study. We know that the control group got a lot of animal fat. We know some of it was butter. We know some of it was not animal fat, but rather hydrogenated plant oils. But we don't know the proportions. What we do know is that the diet was very poor in vitamin E, even compared to what it would have been if the subjects were consuming commercial run-of-the-mill butter as their main fat. 3 times lower in vitamin E than what they would have gotten from regular old commercial butter, let alone something more nutritious like grass-fed butter. And smoking increases the turnover of vitamin E and makes you need more of it. They were smoking more and getting less of it. Well, the authors of this study published an analysis where after the main analysis, they came out and they displayed the heart disease data according to cigarette smokers And what they found was that all of the excess heart disease related death occurred in people who were smoking more than 10 cigarettes per day and eating the control diet that was really poor in vitamin E. So when you look at that, it's very reasonable to look at that trial and say the reason that heart disease was lower on the polyunsaturated fat diet is because in the control diet, cigarette smoking was depleting vitamin E and causing oxidative stress. The diet was really poor in vitamin E and really poorly equipped to protect against the effect of smoking. Therefore, it caused vulnerability and allowed that greater amount of cigarette smoking to contribute to heart disease. That's a totally reasonable interpretation. What's scary about that trial is that smoking also causes cancer, and yet cancer was rising in the polyunsaturated fat group. So something about replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats seems to contribute worse to cancer than cigarette smoking. So, before you come out and make a national recommendation to, or I should say, before you come out and reinforce a decades-old national recommendation to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats, we should discuss this deeply concerning potential for that recommendation to contribute to the risk of cancer. The one remaining trial in this meta-analysis of 4 core studies is the Medical Research Council study. What they did was they asked the people to drop their usual fat consumption and replace it with soybean oil. And they had to drink at least half of the soybean oil as a raw oil and chase it down with juice. Now, I shouldn't say a raw oil. I don't know what the processing was before they got the oil, but they weren't cooking with it. And so right away, that difference is going to mean that the experimental group probably has less heat damage to their oils in their diet, and that could be protective of heart disease. But also, it's the only one of these trials that used exclusively soybean oil. I am not a fan of soybean oil. However, when you look at soybean oil compared to all these other vegetable oils, a couple things stand out. Number one, it's much more balanced between omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids than most of the other vegetable oils. I don't use soybean oil, and I wouldn't recommend it as a source of omega-3 fatty acids, but the fact that it is balanced instead of being very biased towards omega-6 fatty acids like many of the other oils is significant and could explain why it looks better in its results than some other trials. Further, soybean oil stands out as highly unusual among not only plant oils, but plant foods in general for being very rich in coenzyme Q10. Coenzyme Q10 plays an important role in energy metabolism. It's very supportive of the heart and is thought to be especially protective against congestive heart failure. And the fact that it's so important to the heart can be seen by looking at its distribution among foods. By far and away, overwhelmingly, the richest source of coenzyme Q10 is the heart of an animal. That's because the heart needs so much coenzyme Q10. And for soybean oil, again, I'm not a fan of it for a lot of reasons, but for it to stand out as having a lot of coenzyme Q10 strikes me as potentially significant. In fact, there are animal studies showing that polyunsaturated fats reduce longevity in rodents, and you can protect against that by supplying coenzyme Q10. So these facts make the Medical Research Council study fairly unique. And I don't have a criticism of it. I think that it showed a trend towards a protective effect of the soybean oil. It wasn't statistically significant on its own. And were it incorporated into a meta-analysis of other trials and made a minor contribution to the results, I would have no problem with it. But in this context, it's a study that really stands on its own. Once we dismiss the Finnish Mental Hospital study for not being randomized, the Oslo study for being multifactorial, and the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study for actually showing an effect that might just be due to smoking and vitamin E deficiency, and suggesting that PUFAs, polyunsaturated fats, may contribute to cancer anyway. So now Medical Research Council is left alone in a meta-analysis of one, and its own results aren't statistically significant, so it's not really offering much support here. But let's look then at how some of the trials that were excluded could have impacted this. The AHA excluded 6 trials. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I think it's worth noting 3 of them that I have included in my own analyses in the past when I've looked at this topic. The Rose 1965 trial was the first of these that was ever done, and it replaced saturated fat with corn oil and found that the corn oil doubled the risk of heart disease. Well, it was not statistically significant, even though it was a doubling, and that reflected the fact that the trial was really small. Also, the AHA excluded it on the basis that it was shorter than 2 years. And I think that's completely fair. Because it was so small, had they included it, it wouldn't have made a big difference in the data. But excluding it on that basis is legitimate in my opinion. The Minnesota Coronary Survey was the only trial that was double-blind besides the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study. But the average person in that trial was only on the diet for a year. And on that basis, it doesn't fit their criteria, and I think that's fair. The Sydney Diet Heart Study, they exclude on the following basis. They say, quote, "The Sydney Heart Study was unique among the diet trials on cardiovascular disease because a margarine high in trans unsaturated fat was a major component of the diet for participants assigned to the high polyunsaturated diet. When this trial was conducted, there was little recognition of the harms of trans unsaturated fat in partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. So the researchers inadvertently tested substitution of saturated with an even more atherogenic trans fat." End quote. Actually, we don't really know the degree to which trans fat had any impact here. The principal discussion that this falls back on is actually driven not so much by the original paper on the Sydney Diet Heart Study, which was published in 1978, but on a re-evaluation of the data that Christopher Ramsden's group had published in 2013. And in the original Sydney Diet Heart paper, they didn't separate the deaths between cardiovascular disease and non-cardiovascular disease. They just reported that the polyunsaturated fat group had 39% lower survival over time. And Ramsden's group uncovered some unpublished data, and they were able to show that when you look specifically at cardiovascular disease, there was about 1/3 greater, 33% greater coronary heart disease deaths in the group that got the polyunsaturated fat. And one of the things that came out of that was that part of the intervention was to give this margarine that was a soft, high polyunsaturated fat margarine. The intention was clearly to increase the polyunsaturated fat levels. But if you look at the responses to that paper in the British Medical Journal, which I'll link to in the show notes, which will be at chrismasterjohnphd.com/41, Jean Gutierrez, university faculty assistant professor of George Washington University, wrote that the study had a serious flaw. The PUFA supplemented intervention group may have been provided with atherogenic trans fat, and the investigators cannot prove otherwise. In other words, not we know how much trans fat there was, but there may have been trans fat there. The Ramsden group then made an extensive defense of looking at this paper as probably showing the effect of omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids rather than trans fats. And some of the things that they point out is that the intervention group was given a high polyunsaturated margarine that was softer than the common margarines at the time because it had less trans fat and more polyunsaturated fat. The control group was also eating common margarines at the time, and so most likely there were pretty similar intakes of trans fats between the two groups. Certainly both groups were eating trans fats, and the effect of the intervention to give the softer, more polyunsaturated margarine was probably to net displace margarines that were higher in trans fats. The end result is we don't know how much trans fat they were eating, and so we don't know how much of a confounder it was. Well, let's take examples that we've already talked about. The LA Veterans Administration Hospital study, which was included, allowed hydrogenated oils in the control group in addition to animal fats. So what's happening here is that in both trials, there's some unknown degree of confounding by trans fats. But in the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study, that unknown confounding is located in the control group eating the saturated fat. Therefore, that trial's fair game to include because the harmful effect of trans fats are located in the group consuming the other fat that we want to tell people not to eat anyway. In Sydney Diet Heart, they're worried that the unknown confounding of trans fats is occurring in the experimental group eating polyunsaturated fat. So now suddenly it's a basis for excluding that trial. So let's just consider the impact of including and excluding these trials. I before said that the Medical Research Council study was the one that was least confounded by these other concerns. The Medical Research Council study found an 18% decrease in the risk of heart disease that was not statistically significant on its own in the soybean oil group. The Sydney Diet Heart study found a 33% increase in the risk of heart disease that was not statistically significant, but was P equals 0.06, so right on the border of what's conventionally considered statistically significant. 33% is almost twice 18%. So including the Sydney Diet Heart study would tip the balance in the opposite direction towards a harmful effect if you're balancing it against the Medical Research Council study. So really, this is not straightforward at all. You can't come to a mathematical conclusion about this. In principle, meta-analyses are a great way to look at the data when you have a lot of trials that are well done and can be pooled without further discussion. And you can just take that mathematical result and make a conclusion. But clearly, these trials deserve qualitative descriptions because there are so many nuances. And simply making judgments about why to include or exclude one trial versus another can radically change the quantitative conclusion that you'd get. So in summary, we have the Medical Research Council study looking favorably upon polyunsaturated fats, but maybe that's driven by the lack of heat damage in the oil, the coenzyme Q10, or the balance between omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. We have the Sydney Diet Heart study that looks really bad for polyunsaturated fats, but maybe that's driven by some confounding by trans fats, or maybe it's driven by the fact that the oil was largely safflower oil and biased towards omega-6. We have the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study. That is a really important trial, but it looks like it's more about the fact that smoking on a background diet poor in vitamin E and antioxidant protection is going to worsen your risk for heart disease, but it's not going to contribute to cancer the way that vegetable oils will. Meanwhile, the Oslo Diet Heart study seems to suggest that you can get away with eating polyunsaturated fats if you also get rid of your margarine, eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, and eat sardines, canned, and cod liver oil. So from this mix of trials, we should feel at best ambivalent about polyunsaturated fats. This really is the core of the AHA paper because it's where they made this unique contribution to come in on this debate between the conventional viewpoint and the one by Ramsden and say, this is how we want to make our unique meta-analysis. They then move on to the observational studies. They really don't contribute any unique analysis. They cite what's existing, which is that observational studies, particularly when pooled together, show that those who eat more polyunsaturated fat have a lower risk of heart disease. I wouldn't even dispute that. What I would note instead is that every single one of those trials started after there was a national campaign begun by the American Heart Association in 1961 to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats to lower the risk of heart disease. The earliest of any of the observational studies in its original inception started in 1963, 2 years later. Most of them started much later than that. The earliest of these studies had the final analysis published in the 1990s or later. So we're looking at the analysis of data that was, the collection may have begun in the 1960s at earliest, after the national campaign started, but the study crosses the border lines of these decades where the full effects of that national campaign were manifest. Basically, between 1961, begun by the American Heart Association, this campaign was truly solidified in its peak in the 1984 NIH Consensus Conference, where the NIH concluded that, yes, cholesterol causes heart disease. And then Time magazine came out with the famous cover of the frowning face with the eyes being eggs and the frowning mouth being bacon, and saying, hold the eggs and butter, cholesterol is finally proven deadly and our diets will never be the same. And then said in that article, finally, the American Heart Association, which has been saying this since 1961, is vindicated. So these observational studies are looking at what are people spontaneously choosing to do, and what does their risk of heart disease look like? Well, maybe they have a lower risk of heart disease when they eat vegetable oils because vegetable oils prevent heart disease. Or maybe people who are health conscious, who have many health conscious behaviors, choose to do what's recommended for their hearts by the American Heart Association in the 1960s. And the 1980s and 90s choose to do what everyone says is good for their hearts because they are heart healthy, health conscious people who are conscientious and carrying that load of many positive health conscious habits. If you were to show me that in 1933, someone who ate more polyunsaturated fat got more heart disease in 1957, I would find that far more convincing than you telling me that people who consumed more polyunsaturated fat in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s had less heart disease in the 1990s, the 2000s, and the 2010s. So we have this observational data that is hopelessly confounded by the national campaign to do exactly what's being studied. And if it were in clear agreement with the randomized controlled trials and the RCTs were all in clear agreement with each other, then yes, it would look like there's a consensus of evidence, which is what the American Heart Association is saying. But given what we just went through with the randomized controlled trials and this hopeless confounding by public perception of what's healthy, then there is no clear consensus of evidence that polyunsaturated fats prevent heart disease. The AHA then goes on to talk about experiments in monkeys. And they discussed experiments where monkeys were given lard or palm oil and dietary cholesterol to bring their cholesterol to 300 to 400 milligrams per deciliter, and this increased the risk of heart disease. Well, in humans, the only people who get cholesterol of 300 to 400 milligrams per deciliter are people with serious metabolic backups and cholesterol metabolism that in most cases are people with familial hypercholesterolemia and perhaps are people with serious thyroid disorders or other problems of that magnitude. So I would have no problem saying that if your cholesterol is 300 to 400 milligrams per deciliter, you should consider cutting down your consumption of coconut oil or other saturated fats and see if it's responsive, because if a metabolic pathway is seriously backed up, you want to remove the stress on that metabolic pathway. We really should consider these animal experiments and the randomized controlled trials and the observational studies in the context of what we know about the pathogenesis of heart disease. The AHA position paper never discusses the oxidation of lipoproteins in the blood. They stop at talking about raising LDL cholesterol levels. But the consensus mainstream view, which I think is correct, is that the high cholesterol levels themselves are not the actual mechanistic culprit. This can be seen best by looking at the book by Daniel Steinberg, Cholesterol Wars, The Skeptics versus the Preponderance of the Evidence. No one carries the authority of the conventional viewpoint better than Daniel Steinberg, except perhaps a handful of other people like Brown and Goldstein, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the LDL receptor in 1985, or some of the other people who were in the top administrative positions in the NIH in the 1980s. Steinberg was the director of the coronary primary prevention trial, which was the big cholesterol-lowering drug trial that was used as the primary basis for the conclusion in 1984 that high cholesterol levels are the cause of heart disease. He was the chairman of the 1984 NIH consensus conference that came to that conclusion. He also himself made some of the first, he and his team made some of the first key discoveries of how high cholesterol causes heart disease. And in his book, The Cholesterol Wars, he refers to high cholesterol as the cause of heart disease over and over again. But then he comes to the chapter where he says, if we wanted to clinch the argument that high cholesterol is the cause of heart disease, we needed to know the mechanism. How does the cholesterol get into the artery wall? And that chapter on the pathogenesis, on the mechanism of how high cholesterol causes heart disease, is all about the oxidation of the lipoprotein. The lipoprotein is the vehicle by which cholesterol and fat-soluble nutrients are transported in the blood. It's covered by a membrane of phospholipids. Phospholipids are a combination of phosphate and lipids. The phosphate is water-soluble and faces the outside. That water-soluble outside layer of phosphate groups is what allows the lipoprotein to be transported in the blood, which is made mostly of water. And the fatty acid tails of these phospholipids point inward towards the core of the particle where all the other lipids that it's carrying are. And in those phospholipids, there are 2 fatty acids per phospholipid. Some of those fatty acids are polyunsaturated, the kind of fatty acids that are found in vegetable oils. Polyunsaturated fatty acids found in vegetable oils are uniquely vulnerable to a process called lipid peroxidation. They're not more vulnerable, they're uniquely vulnerable because the carbon on the fatty acid that is the site of vulnerability to this process of lipid peroxidation is the carbon between 2 double bonds. And only polyunsaturated fatty acids have 2 or more double bonds. And this process of lipid peroxidation is a form of oxidative damage. Another form of oxidative damage that we're more familiar with in our macroscopic lives is rust. You leave your bicycle outside, it rains, it's exposed to the air, oxygen comes in and damages the steel, and it rusts. Well, it's not rusting. It's a different process when it happens to fatty acids, but lipid peroxidation is the analog of your bicycle rusting when it's been left out. What Steinberg's own group discovered was that the lipoprotein particle has to oxidize to become damaged, to be taken up by the immune system within an atherosclerotic plaque. And that oxidation was driven by the initial peroxidation of the polyunsaturated fatty acids in the lipoprotein. When you consume polyunsaturated fatty acids, a well-known effect is that you lower cholesterol levels. A less appreciated but uncontroversial effect is that you also increase the number of polyunsaturated fatty acids in the membrane of the LDL particle. If polyunsaturated fatty acids lower the amount of cholesterol and the number of those lipoprotein particles in the blood, there are fewer particles that can oxidize. They're also getting taken out of the blood more quickly, which I actually think is even more significant because there's less time for them to oxidize. But you've also increased the vulnerable components that promote the oxidation. So which one of those things wins out? Well, I don't know. It has to be studied, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why the data is such an utter mess. if you look at something like the monkey experiments, where their cholesterol goes to 300 to 400 milligrams per deciliter, what's happening there? Well, the ability to clear the lipoproteins from the blood is becoming overwhelmed. And so that's why the cholesterol is rising to much higher levels than you would usually see. That in turn implies that those lipoproteins with their polyunsaturated fatty acids are spending longer time in the blood and being more available for oxidation, even though the saturated fat and the cholesterol were what were used to cause the clogging up of that metabolic pathway. The polyunsaturated fats are still in those lipoproteins, and they're still the things that are oxidized first and drive the oxidation of the particle and the contribution to atherosclerosis. So without doubting the effects in those experiments, it doesn't follow that any consumption of anything by a human that raises cholesterol to any degree causes heart disease in that same proportion. So now we come, after this long and winding road, to this question about coconut oil. The AHA position on coconut oil is based on how coconut oil impacts LDL cholesterol. They say the fatty acid profile, and this is quoting, the fatty acid profile of coconut oil is 82% saturated, about half lauric acid, and the rest myristic, palmitic, stearic, and short-chain fatty acids. This is me here. I think they mean medium-chain fatty acids. Anyway, going on. Quote, lauric acid replacing carbohydrates increases LDL cholesterol, but by about half as much as myristic and palmitic acids. Lauric acid increases HDL cholesterol about as much as myristic, but more than palmitic acid. The net effect of increasing lauric acid and decreasing carbohydrates is a slight reduction in the ratio of LDL cholesterol to HDL cholesterol. Me coming in here, the point that they're about to dispute that they've just made is that if LDL cholesterol is the bad cholesterol and HDL cholesterol is the good cholesterol, and the fatty acids in coconut oil improve the ratio of LDL to HDL cholesterol, that seems like a good thing. They then go on, quote, however, as discussed earlier in this report, changes in HDL cholesterol caused by diet or drug treatments can no longer be directly linked to changes in cardiovascular disease. Me coming in here, the point that they had made was that we have drugs, for example, cholesterol ester transfer protein, CETP inhibitors, that, such as anacetrapib, for example, and torcetrapib, that work to play with that ratio to boost up HDL cholesterol at the expense of LDL, and don't seem to have a powerful effect on heart disease, or maybe even have negative effects. And so they're saying here, even though correlationally, the higher your HDL and the lower your LDL, the better your risk for heart disease, there are interventions that modify it in the way that we would think is good and don't produce the good outcome. Therefore, we can't jump to conclusions that just because something's modifying the markers, they're having the same impact on the disease. Well, that's completely true. But the way they make this conclusion is to say as follows. Quote, however, as discussed earlier in this report, changes in HDL cholesterol caused by diet or drug treatments can no longer be directly linked to changes in cardiovascular disease, and therefore, the LDL cholesterol raising effect should be considered on its own. This was going so well up until that last half of the sentence. Yes, it's true that just because we change the markers in the way that looks good doesn't mean we change the disease in the way we think it does. So true. Another great example of this is the one that I had brought up before, which is that if polyunsaturated fats lower cholesterol, it doesn't mean that they lower heart disease just because cholesterol correlates with heart disease. And mechanistically, we can argue that very point even more confidently because we know that there are mechanistic reasons to say that polyunsaturated fats help clear lipoproteins from the blood. Check. Polyunsaturated fats raise the risk of oxidizing the particles that are in the blood. No good. But here they come so close to correctly concluding that we can't jump from conclusions about surrogate markers to the actual disease and instead say that we should exclusively consider the fact that coconut oil raises LDL cholesterol and ignore its impact on HDL cholesterol. They then conclude as follows, quote, clinical trials that compared direct effects on cardiovascular disease of coconut oil and other dietary oils have not been reported. However, because coconut oil increases LDL cholesterol, a cause of cardiovascular disease, and has no known offsetting favorable effects, we advise against the use of coconut oil. End quote. No known offsetting favorable effects. They just told us that it raises HDL cholesterol more than LDL cholesterol, and then they told us to ignore it because we can't trust surrogate markers when we don't have actual disease data. But then they told us that despite the fact that we don't have any disease data on coconut oil, we should take this surrogate marker of LDL cholesterol because it's a cause of heart disease and because there's no known offsetting favorable effects, nothing like, raising HDL, then we advise against the use of coconut oil. To be fair, they do make the argument that the associations with LDL and cardiovascular disease are more consistent than the inverse association with HDL. But that's a difference of degree. They're arguing that they're relatively more confident in the surrogate marker of LDL than they are in the surrogate marker of HDL. The bottom line is still that they don't have any evidence that coconut oil causes cardiovascular disease, and that they admit that. And that should lead to at least some ambivalence to say that perhaps the 37% of nutritionists who consider coconut oil as a healthy food and the 72% of the American public that seem to think so as well may have a point. Furthermore, this is entirely focused on heart disease. Well, that's fair. This is the American Heart Association. But when you're considering what foods you're going to eat, you're going to consider, or you should consider, the big picture. And the big picture includes, for example, that lauric, capric, and caprylic acids are fatty acids with antifungal and antibacterial effects that could be very useful in supporting defense against infections, for example. If you're dealing with a person whose primary problem right now is that they're fighting a difficult fungal infection or something like that, and their immediate concern is not that heart disease is around the corner, then even if you were to take the AHA position on the cardiovascular effects of coconut oil, which have all the problems that we've already considered, it still might make sense for that person to be using coconut oil in their diet because their primary concern, the thing that's most imminently affecting them, is infectious burden instead of the distant prospect of heart disease some decades down the road. Also, coconut oil is probably somewhat beneficial to energy metabolism. I think the degree to which people say it is on the internet is totally overblown, but 15% of the fatty acids in coconut oil are 8 and 10 carbon fatty acids that are able to enter into the mitochondria to be burned for energy in ways that circumvent the suppressive effects of insulin on fat burning. So you can put coconut oil on your pasta, and the insulin from the pasta is not going to suppress burning those 15% of those fatty acids. And there are convincing studies using MCT oil, which is 100% 8 and 10 carbon fatty acids, showing that it increases energy expenditure and suppresses appetite. My guess is that's because it's increasing energy expenditure in the brain, and that's telling the brain that you don't need as much food. Whatever the exact mechanisms, using MCT oil can lead to a net caloric deficit without trying to cut calories. Now, there's no equivalent evidence suggesting that coconut oil does the same thing. Well, in my view, that's because there's 6 times more of those fatty acids in MCT oil than in coconut oil. So you're either going to have 6 times more people in the study to have the statistical power to see the 6 times smaller difference, or you're going to have to make the study 6 times longer so that the smaller difference adds up, or somehow get around the fact that coconut oil is 6 times less effective as MCT oil with respect to that particular property. So I don't think coconut oil is any kind of miracle weight loss aid, but it probably has some benefits towards energy metabolism in that sense. Finally, the big elephant in the room here is that the AHA position paper totally ignores the fact that the oxidation of polyunsaturated fatty acids in the lipoprotein membrane is what drives the oxidation of the particle that makes it contribute to atherosclerosis. The fact that coconut oil has the least amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids out of any edible oil on the market, being 2% to 4 or 5%, depending on exactly how that coconut oil is made, that could be viewed as a favorable offsetting effect when you consider a balanced view of the causes of heart disease and the way that oils contribute. And in that case, that goes beyond the effect on HDL cholesterol. It goes to the heart of the mechanism by which LDL particles contribute to heart disease. So coconut oil may be beneficial in a number of contexts, but even in the context of heart disease, without actual studies showing how coconut oil affects heart disease risk over the long term, it's at least as plausible that it prevents heart disease as it causes it. Still, on a practical level, like I said before, if your cholesterol is 300 to 400 milligrams per deciliter, you have a backup in your metabolism of cholesterol. And in that case, you definitely should be using strategies to try to remove the stress on that system. Because if the lipoproteins aren't moving out of your blood, then the fact that coconut oil fatty acids are enriched in them is not going to stop those lipoproteins from oxidizing and contributing to heart disease. For more on that, though, I'm not going to go into it in this podcast. See episode 38 at chrismasterjohnphd.com/38 what to do about high cholesterol. One type of evidence that was not considered at all in the AHA paper was what happens when people consume coconut fat as the majority of their calories. The American Heart Association talks about how Americans consume too much saturated fat. And they say that adults in the United States, consume 11% of total daily energy intake as saturated fat. Only about 5% of adults consume less than 7%, and 30 to 40% consume more than 10%. Thus, and I'm quoting here, most adults need to reduce saturated fat to reduce their risk of cardiovascular disease. 11% as saturated fat. Consider the diets of the Pacific Islands. On the island of Catawba, they eat a low-fat diet. 20% of their calories are fat, compared to 30 to 40% in the United States. Even in their low-fat diet, because the fat is mostly from coconut, they're eating 17% of their total calories as saturated fat. That is way more than what Americans are consuming. But then you look at other islands in the Pacific, like Tokelau, where they eat less starch and more coconut. They're consuming over 50% of their total calories as saturated fat on the traditional diet when it was measured in several decades ago. That is almost 5 times what the average American is consuming. Well, what's the rate of heart disease on the island of Catawba? According to Staffan Lindeberg's group, it is 0, despite consuming way more saturated fat than Americans in the context of their low-fat diet based on coconut fat. What's the incidence of heart disease on Tokelau? Well, when it was measured several decades ago, it was 0%. No evidence that anyone on the island had heart disease. Now, you could say, well, maybe this is not because coconut oil doesn't cause heart disease. Maybe it's because their genetics are different. Maybe it's because they didn't live long enough to get heart disease. Actually, in the case of Tokelau, we have really strong evidence that that's not the case. In 1966, when the population of Tokelau had reached about 1,870 people, a cyclone hit and devastated the coconut and breadfruit crops. And so the Tokelauans began moving to New Zealand, which had colonized Tokelau at that point, in an assisted migration program. And by 1971, about half of the Tokelauans lived on the mainland of New Zealand. Investigators then looked at their age-adjusted risk of heart disease on Tokelau versus the New Zealand mainland, where the Tokelauans were eating far less coconut and were eating generally less saturated fat. In fact, they were eating half as much saturated fat when they lived in New Zealand. In 1982, in men between the ages of 40 and 69, the incidence of heart disease according to electrocardiogram patterns on the island of Tokelau was 0%. In Tokelauans living in New Zealand, in the same time period, in the same age group in men, the incidence of heart disease by the same method was 1%. Unfortunately, you can't divide a number by 0. It doesn't come out defined. And so you can't say how much heart disease increased as a relative percentage. But we can say that heart disease was switched on by life in New Zealand. And although we can't say that they got heart disease because they started eating half as many calories from saturated fat, we can at least say that the fact that consuming over 50% of calories as saturated fat from coconut was associated with freedom from heart disease on the island of Tokelau. It is not explained by the fact that Tokelauans have genetics that don't allow them to get heart disease, and it's not explained by the fact that Tokelauans didn't live long enough to get heart disease, because controlling for genetics and controlling for age, they did get heart disease on New Zealand and didn't get heart disease on Tokelau, despite consuming less saturated fat. That level of saturated fat was far more than what Americans are consuming at 11%. It was about 5 times more. If coconut oil causes heart disease, it at least requires a context to do so that's radically different from the context on Tokelau. And to be fair, maybe you and I are both living in that context. Maybe modern life in all its stress. Maybe artificial lighting. Maybe the consumption of products of affluence, refined foods, a lot more meat than was consumed on Tokelau. Whatever it may be, maybe our context activates the cardiovascular devastation caused by coconut oil that could never be witnessed in its native context when consumed as the majority, the literal majority of the diet. But when we consider the fact that the randomized controlled trials do not provide convincing evidence that the observational studies are hopelessly confounded by the public campaigns that made it desirable and health conscious to restrict saturated fat for your heart during the entire time in which it was studied. That the animal experiments are looking at the extreme case where of course it's rational to keep your cholesterol below that. That the mechanistic evidence argues that it's about oxidation and coconut oil would be protective in that context, at least in terms of the intrinsic vulnerability of the lipoprotein to the oxidative damage. When you consider all these things and you look at this striking example of incomprehensible levels of saturated fat consumed in the total absence of heart disease, despite genetic and age ability to get heart disease, you really have to step back and put all your emphasis on one single sentence from the AHA report. That sentence is the following: clinical trials that compared direct effects on cardiovascular disease of coconut oil and other dietary oils have not been reported. Full stop. Ignore the however after it. I'll read it again. This is quoting directly from the paper. Clinical trials that compared direct effects on CVD of coconut oil and other dietary oils have not been reported. End quote. As for me, I've eaten coconut oil twice today. Once was when I cooked my potato for breakfast, and the other was when I cooked my potato for lunch. Signing off, this is Chris Masterjohn of chrismasterjohnphd.com. You've been listening to Mastering Nutrition, and the show notes for this episode 41 of the Mastering Nutrition podcast, can be found at chrismasterjohnphd.com/41. I just have one ask before you leave, and that is, if you haven't done so already, please leave the podcast a review. In iTunes or your favorite podcast app, this isn't just about giving me your feedback, although I appreciate any feedback you can give me, but leaving those reviews really helps with the visibility and the success of the podcast. So if you could do one little thing to spread the word, please leave a review. Thank you so much. This episode is brought to you by US Wellness Meats. I discovered this company at PaleoFX this spring, and I fell in love with them as soon as I tried their liverwurst. For years, I've known that I feel best when I eat a diversity of organ meats like liver and heart. I have a clearer mind, I feel more energetic, and my energy is much more stable between meals. But it's so hard and so time-consuming to make a sustainable habit out of preparing and cooking organ meats. US Wellness Liverwurst is 15% heart, 15% kidney, and 20% liver, with the remainder grass-fed beef. That's a whopping half organ meat. It takes zero time to prepare, tastes great, and finally makes consuming a diversity of organ meats a habit that I can easily sustain. But just because I'm obsessed with their liverwurst doesn't mean it'll turn out to be your favorite. US Wellness makes an even milder Braunschweiger that's 35% liver and 65% beef. And if you have a really sensitive palate and just want to get your feet wet with organ meats, their head cheese delivers the mildest taste with 15% heart, 15% tongue, and the remainder beef. They also sell an incredible array of other meat products in practically any cut you could want, all from animals raised on pasture. Now, this isn't just about high-quality grass-fed meat products that can up your nutritional game and save you time in the morning. It's also about saving money, and that's because I worked out a special deal for you. As a member of my audience, you can go to grasslandbeef.com, order whatever you want as long as your total order is at least 7 pounds and at least $75 after applying the discount, and as long as it's under 40 pounds. And you just enter the promo code Chris at checkout. Putting my name in the box earns you 15% off your order, and since you can order up to 39.9999999 pounds of meat at that discount, you can potentially save a lot of money. If you're on the fence or you're not ready for a big order, don't worry about it. You can use the promo code Chris not once, but twice. So order the minimum your first time, and if you love this stuff as much as I do, you can order the max the second time around and get the same level of discount. Or just max out your order both times and get just shy of 80 pounds of meat at the discounted price. Either way, head over to grasslandbeef.com and make sure you enter Chris at checkout to get the discount. This is your brain reminding you that what you were just about to do was leave a review.